Hero Time, Chapter 30, Stranded. Jen would never say that fighting a hybrid was easy. Even with 6 echoes crawling all over the thing, blasting sound it barely slowed. Then Kevin threw a rock at the teleporter. Jen barely had time to let out an aborted screech before both she and the hybrid were dragged into the blue swirling portal. Gwen screamed as her cousin and the hybrid vanished together. Kevin ducked as pink light began to fly. "Gwen, we can get her back. It's a teleporter, but I need it intact to fix it." He ducked and covered his head. The pink light flickered and he blinked as they vanished, leaving just the afterimage. Gwen was taking deep, calming breaths. "You're sure you can fix it?" Kevin nodded at the redhead. "Piece of cake." He probably shouldn't mention he had no idea how to make a cake. "It's just gonna take some time." He wasn't exactly lying, but since he'd more than likely busted a stabilizer when he chucked the rock at construction, there was no telling exactly where in the galaxy Jen had ended up. Add to that the fact that she and the hybrid had teleported together, and the odds of getting her back alive shrank to single digits. Of course, he wasn't going to tell Gwen that. He did not need an angry Anodite breathing down his neck while he worked. More than he already had one, anyway. He quickly began to assess the damage. The quartz that made up the majority of the teleporter was cracked where the rock had struck it. Kevin absorbed a bit of the quartz, just enough to cover his hand, and focused on the feel, letting the quartz spread, forming an easy patch through the crack. "That's actually a really cool power," Gwen said, watching him closely. He nodded, smiling slightly. "Thanks, I learned it in prison. It makes welding really easy." Gwen laughed lightly. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Kevin was stunned that Gwen had enough faith in him to be laughing moments after losing her cousin, possibly forever. She trusted him to get her back. He refocused on the task at hand, taking a deep breath. He had to get this right. Reinrosik III, 7th son of the noble house of Highbreed, noble heir to the purest blood in the universe, was annoyed. For the past few weeks, he'd been losing DNAliens here and there to the plumber's spawn. Unworthy creatures that they were, it took them a considerable amount of time to find him. The boorish one, the male of the group, Reinrosik was reasonably certain, though not entirely sure, had damaged the teleporter. He threw a rock at it, like the mongrel vermin he was. The changeling he'd been warned about had been clinging to him, disgusting tiny creatures. Then they were both tossed through the portal. The fight between the two of them and the sandworm was over quickly, only because the two of them worked together. They would need to work together to survive. It became blatantly clear to him very quickly that he was dealing with a child, and that set him back a bit. He'd admit that, though only to himself. Vermin was vermin, right? She was a persistent little wretch, changing shape several times into other aliens, but that wasn't even the most annoying thing. The most annoying thing was how persistent she was about helping. At every turn, every inconvenience, she leapt into action to try and right the situation. He did not need a child to save him, to care. Yet care she seemed to. It was nothing like what his lessons had taught him. He had been trained from a very young age that the hybrid were the superior race in the universe. Of course they were. But he had also learned that every other being in the galaxy was beneath them, and would be unhelpful and bitter towards them, and should be treated with contempt. But Jen Tennyson was not unhelpful. She listened when he spoke, argued like the rest of her filthy kind, but saved his life multiple times. He did not understand it. Everything he'd learned was being called into question by this young human. No, he could not question it now. "I'm going to call you Riney." He could not believe the audacity of this creature. She didn't seem to be paying attention to him, though. She was poking the fire with a stick. It's weird. Despite the fact that I don't trust you any farther than I could actually throw you, it's pretty cool how we've managed to work together to survive. We aren't friends, but we aren't exactly mortal enemies anymore either. You and I are enemies. How did this human child not understand that? My point is, we've been able to see past our differences. She poked the fire again. Let me put it this way. I try to see things from every perspective. And usually it's pretty easy because I have to be a lot of other things than what I am. It widens the view of the universe. I've never been a hybrid, but who knows? Maybe the DNA is in the Omnitrix. I get to walk a mile in other life forms' shoes all the time. Such presumption! But what else is to be expected from a genetically inferior creature? She looked up at him, confusion and a bit of offense written on her face. Why would I, a pure hybrid, ever want to become friends with a lowly creature like you? The human rolled her eyes and tossed the stick she'd been using to poke the fire into the blaze. The night on the desert planet was cool, pleasantly to him, but he knew humans preferred it a little warmer than this. She had given him her jacket when the suns and heat had proved too much for him. He hadn't wanted it. She had offered it of her own accord. He had been forced to take it after they stopped for water. The suns were quite intense, and the human skin was redder than normal, but she didn't seem to have any other adverse effects from the climate. I was trying to be nice, find some common ground. You and I are more than mere enemies. He went on to explain the proud history of the hybrid, the first race in the universe. It was a story every hybrid learned as a child. All other species were mongrels, spawned of rebellion and treachery. Hideous abominations of nature, especially humans. As soon as I no longer require your aid for my own protection, Tennyson, I shall eradicate you, and there will be one less vermin infesting a grateful universe. She glared at him, then she shook her head, frowning. You can't really believe all that. Not after everything we just went through. Not after the way I've been helping you. When you weren't trying to kill me. They were both silent for a moment, red eyes glaring into green. You are tired, human. I shall take the first watch. No, I'm wide awake. I'll take the first watch. At least I won't kill you in your sleep. I don't trust you to offer the same. She sat down by the fire and picked up another stick, poking at it. But despite her assurances of being very much awake, Reinrossick could see the tiredness in the way she held herself. He'd been observing humans for quite some time on Earth, after all. He'd learned things from the prisoners. He was in charge of overseeing one of the egg machines on Earth for the production of more DNAliens to complete their work. He'd seen more than a few humans and never cared. Why was he starting to now? The two unlikely companions remained silent. After a while, Reinrossick looked over and tilted his head. She had fallen asleep, flopped over, not too far from the fire, on the slightly warmer sand. He breathed out. She was so clearly a child. He had not seen a child in a very long time. Every child born on the hybrid homeworld these days was precious, something celebrated by all of them. That celebration had not occurred for so long he could barely remember the last time it had occurred. He glanced down at the jacket sitting in the sand next to him as the human shivered slightly in a gust of night wind. Once the sun went down on this planet, the temperature plummeted. It took a few more shivers for him to give in to this feeling in his chest. He tossed the jacket over her, careful only to ensure that the sleeves did not end up in the fire. Why? Why had he done that? He should slit her throat while she slept and be done with it. The universe would be grateful to be rid of one more piece of filth. He stepped forward and stopped as the sand moved. Not 5 feet from the sleeping human, one of the crawling, burrowing sand bugs dug its way out of the dune. It nosed at the air for a moment. Then it turned to the sleeping, defenseless human. All he had to do now was nothing. He was only a few hours away from the teleporter, assuming the human was correct in her directions. Echolocation was not something the hybrid could do. The bug scuttled closer to the girl. Reinrossick stepped over her, and she finally stirred and screamed. He couldn't blame her. He had threatened to kill her. It probably looked suspicious. But she seemed to assess the situation quickly as she rolled out of the way, and he swatted the bug out of the air mid-leap, with a quick flurry of spikes from his fingertips. She scrambled backwards in the sand as the bug lunged again, and this time he caught it around the middle. His mistake, as he discovered when it twisted pincers around his upper wrist, scissoring through it in an instant. He cried out as the bug was dropped from useless fingers. Can you regenerate it? Her question was childish, slightly stupid, too, something he was quick to point out to her. He did not expect what she did next, transforming into the creature she called Swamp Fire and reattaching his arm. He shook his head as he flexed his fingers. Better? she asked as she turned back to her normal human form.
Why would you heal me?
He truly didn't understand. She shook her head as she retrieved her jacket, seeming only to realize now that it had been on top of her as she slept, though it had not been there when she fell asleep. Why would you help me? She shook out her jacket and shivered slightly before slipping it on. It was still cold night around them, no telling when the suns would rise again. It was in my own interest to stop that creature from killing you. That wasn't all of it. He had been contemplating slitting her throat in her sleep, after all. And it's in my interest to help anyone who needs it. He remained silent. He turned away from her and sat down, looking up and flexing his fingers. Tennyson did not seem to know what to do either. The silence became slightly oppressive as Rosik tried to find out a star pattern he knew. I will wake you in the morning, Tennyson. She shook her head, glancing back over at the dead bug where it was still smoldering in the sand. Don't think I could get back to sleep now if I even tried. Instead, she sat down not too far from him, looking up just like him. I don't recognize any of them. She sounded a little forlorn. Rosik remained silent for a moment before he pointed upward with the hand she'd just healed. That bright one there is the star you call Betelgeuse. Jen blinked at him. How do you know what we call it on Earth? Wouldn't think you had much time to learn Earth astronomy with the whole big plan thing. Whether or not she was fishing for information he could not tell. He shook his head. The whole sector refers to it as that. They went silent again, but Jen looked slightly more contented, looking up at the star he'd indicated. Then she sighed and stood. Well, either you can sleep or we can head out. No point in waiting around here any longer than we have to. He nodded at her. I do not require as much sleep as you. We should continue. She nodded, and they continued in silence. Rosik made up his mind by the time they made it back to the teleporter. He would not be returning to Earth. There it is! Come on! She took off at a run as the suns began to rise. He stopped, and so did she, shoes skidding slightly in the sand. Not the whole 10 paces behind thing again. Go home, Tennyson. I shall remain here. She looked at him in such confusion he was reminded of the last time he had looked into the eyes of a hybrid child. She shook her head. Did you hit your head or something? The teleporter is right there. We can finally go back to our lives. And yet, he could not. He could not go back to the other hybrid with his tainted arm. I have spent too long with you, Tennyson, and therefore myself have become contaminated. Contaminated with doubt, as much as with the DNA of her Mephistophelian form. Contaminated. As clearly evidenced by my uncharacteristic behavior, risking my own life to save you, a lowly human. Bryony, what you did was a good thing. He did not even object to the childish nickname anymore. He had, elders help him, grown nearly fond of this being. I have obviously become infected by your mongrel influence and am now myself unclean. Even if I believed that, why stay here? This place will kill you. In self-imposed exile, as it should be. For I can never return home or anywhere I could infect the rest of my kind. The only honorable choice is to remain here. No, she shook her head, a child denying a hard truth. Because all beings other than pure, unadulterated hybrid must be expunged from the galaxy, including myself. She seemed to grow angry at his words. I thought I had gotten through to you. I thought you had changed. He nodded at her. This much is true. I have changed. And now I must pay the price. Kevin was beginning to panic. The teleporter was fixed. He'd done everything in his power to make it work. But it still wasn't working. Everything is fine on it. It should be working. Unless there was nothing to bring back through. Unless the damaged stabilizer had sent Jen and the hybrid into a sun or some other gruesome fate. We have to get her back. There has to be something we can do. Gwen was close to tears, anger giving way to grief. Then the portal lit up blue and Kevin held his breath. This was the moment of truth. Please let it be Jen who came out of the portal first, or at all at this point, really. He and Gwen had been here for hours. It was nearing 3 in the morning. Then a lone figure hopped out of the portal, and Kevin breathed a sigh of relief as Gwen let out a cheer. It was far too short to be a hybrid. Jen! Gwen embraced her cousin as soon as she could, pulling back when she noticed the sunburn on her cheeks and across the bridge of her nose. She was slightly scratched, too, and there was sand clinging to her hair and skin, not to mention her clothes. Kevin ruffled her hair, sending a wave of sand falling to the warehouse floor.
You gave us a scare there.
Jen grinned at him, then frowned as Gwen spoke again. Where's the hybrid? Did it get away? Jen shook her head, looking back at the teleporter, almost confusion written on her face. I doubt it. Gwen fussed and bundled Jen into Kevin's car, glaring at him when he complained about the sand. At least Jen was kind enough to dump it out of her shoes before getting into the car. He wasn't sure how his apartment became the place to go to when they had an injury, but it had, and he'd stocked up accordingly. Gwen found a bottle of aloe in his cabinet and smeared it on her cousin. What happened? She shook her head. I don't really want to talk about it. If my parents ask, we went to the lake, and I forgot my sunscreen. With that, she wrestled the bottle away from her cousin and went to commandeer Kevin's bathroom to get rid of the sand that clung to her. Kevin glanced at Gwen, who was washing her hands in the kitchen sink.
Do you think she killed it?
Gwen frowned at the soap on her nails like it had personally offended her. I don't know. I don't know if Jen's actually capable of that. But the hybrid are the reason Grandpa Max is gone. Maybe? She sounded scared. Kevin frowned.
It would have killed her if she hadn't.
I know that, but if she did, it would be the first time. She's always done things her way, but she has rules she doesn't break, and her number one rule has always been not to kill except as a complete last resort. She's only ever gone even semi-homicidal on Vilgax, and only when he was threatening me and Grandpa. She shook her head. I don't want her to be capable of that.
Yeah, me neither.
Kevin said, but silently he knew that that was what was most likely. Why else would she not talk about it?